Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Justice and Indigenous Traditional Ecological Knowledge webcast. This webcast is being recorded. And now at this time, I'd like to turn the call over to Dr. Adam Wilkie. Please go ahead.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's USDA Climate, Agriculture, and Forestry Science Seminar Series. My name is Adam Wilkie, and I'm a National Program Leader in the Institute of Bioenergy, Climate, and the Environment at the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and I will be your session host. This seminar series is intended to build a better understanding of the scientific foundation of climate change's relationship to working lands and to ensure a climate-informed workforce for USDA, U.S. government, and important stakeholders. Today, we will learn about climate justice, including definitions and examples of the linkages between climate change, environmental justice, indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, and agriculture and forestry. Climate change, equity, and environmental justice are paramount issues for the President and the Secretary. Some of you here are probably involved in our current Justice 40 efforts, equity action plans, and climate adaptation plans, all of which relate to these issues. Today's speakers will provide their perspectives on the issues and opportunities for climate and environmental justice in agriculture and forestry. A few quick housekeeping reminders. Questions for the speakers should be entered in the Q&A box, which is on the lower half of your screen. These questions are only visible to the presenters, the host, and the chat moderator, and we will address as many questions as we can today. We encourage you to ask anything that will help you understand this topic. We will respond to as many questions as possible, and all unanswered questions will be used to inform future presentations in this series. Remember, this is a science webinar, and our speakers will not be addressing U.S. government or USDA policies on climate change. We are fortunate today to be joined and hear remarks from Dr. Jacoby Wilson and Dr. Frank Lake. Dr. Wilson will start by defining environmental justice and describe climate justice and the contribution of agriculture to climate change, as well as relevant environmental justice issues related to agriculture. Dr. Lake will share lessons learned and approaches for working with American Indian tribes in the Pacific Northwest and California in carrying out climate change research. Remarks shared today are those of the individual invited speakers and should not be construed to represent any official USDA or U.S. government determination or policy. Dr. Jacoby Wilson is an associate professor with the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health and Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, School of Public Health, University of Maryland, College Park. He is a member of the U.S. EPA's Science Advisory Board and editor-in-chief of the journal Environmental Justice. Dr. Wilson received his PhD degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Frank Lake serves as a research ecologist for the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station Fire and Fuels Program. His research focuses on restoration ecology and the incorporation of indigenous knowledge into landscape restoration strategies, wildland fire, and forest management in the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Lake received his PhD degree from Oregon State University. And here to tell us more are our speakers. Please join me in welcoming them. Take it away, Dr. Wilson. Thank you.
Thanks for having me today. Let's go to the slides, please. Am I supposed to go to slides? Okay, here we go. Is this view fine? So today, the time I have, I'll give you a little bit of background set on environmental justice. For those who know what environmental justice is, it's a social movement that's really focused on how some communities are overburdened by environmental hazards and locally wanted land uses. If you think about the history of the environmental justice movement, in many ways, Dr. King is the grandfather of this movement. And his work with the sanitation worker strike was very important in providing a foundation for understanding the connection between social justice, racial justice, health justice, and environmental justice. Oh, sorry. You think about environmental justice, its first definition is EPA's definition. It's the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, culture, with respect to the implementation of laws, regulations, and policies. As mentioned, this federal government, this particular government, is focused on environmental justice more. Under Executive Order 14008, the WEJAC was established, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and they've changed the definition from fair treatment to just treatment. So environmental justice community is really a geographic location where we have a significant number of people of color, low-income persons, indigenous persons, who may experience or be overburdened by the adverse health outcomes related to environmental exposures. Now, I like this definition a little bit better. This is a definition that was coined by Dr. Bunyan Bryant, Professor Emeritus at the University of Michigan. This is really about connecting to the social determinants of health. So think about environmental justice about where we live, where we work, where we play, where we pray, where we learn, right? It's proximal, it's every day, it's pocketbook. It's not just about biodiversity, what's happening over there with a biome. It's about what's local, what's in your neighborhood. And really the social determinants of health frame is very important. So decent paying and safe jobs, quality schools and recreation, decent housing, adequate health care, communities free of violence, drugs, and poverty, really talking about environmental and social determinants of health. And there have been a number of studies, foundational studies on environmental justice. GAO did the first study looking at the distribution of environmental hazards and saw that race was an important predictor of the distribution of those hazards. Another study was Toxic Waste and Race, 1987, which was one of the biggest studies that found that race, again, was the single most important predictor of the distribution of waste sites in the country. And they did a follow-up study 20 years later and still found that race was the most important factor predicting the distribution of environmental hazards. And so when I think about environmental justice issues, you have traditional framing and overburden of hazards, whether it be landfills, chemical plants, it could be chicken farms, it could be cattle feedlots, it could be industrial hog farms, it could be highways and byways, petrochemical operations, refineries, any use, any facility where there's emissions that disproportionately impact a certain social demographic group, okay? You also have those same communities overburdened by high concentration of psychosocial stressors, so poverty and racism, for example. And then these communities tend to also be communities that don't have access to salutogenic infrastructure, whether it be built, social, ecologic, from parks, green space, supermarkets. I'm about to say fast food. Fast food would actually be a pathogenic infrastructure, at least in my framing. Also green space, the types of infrastructure that make the communities healthy. So the building blocks, those ecologic features, those social, natural built features that make communities healthy. And so race, again, as I said earlier, plays a very important role in this. And again, there's a lot of literature, that's scientific literature that speaks to this. So on an average, non-Hispanic whites experience pollution advantage. Will people of color, particularly blacks, experience pollution disadvantage? And so when you think about environmental justice science, in many ways, we're talking about the cumulative impacts of these land uses and these stressors. Again, it could be biological stressors like SARS-CoV-2, mildew allergens, right? It could be chemical stressors like lead, mercury. It could be other stresses. Think about agriculture. It could be nutrients. You're thinking about nitrates if you live near an industrial chicken farm or a hog farm and you have runoff of windblown materials from the chicken pile and that gets in your well water, and potential exposure leads to blue babies disease or other types of health outcomes. It could be physical agents, physical stressors like noise pollution. And then you have psychosocial stressors. So when you think about the EJ science, it's looking at these cumulative impacts, this intersectional alley, and when we think about these stressors, and so burden disparities of hazards lead to exposure disparities to these different chemicals, biological, physical, psychosocial stressors, leads to risk disparities, which then lead to the health disparities. And so you think about relevant health disparities. Exposure disparities would be differential exposure to particulate matter or lead. Think about the Flint issue. Exposure to mercury. Think about people who may consume fish, for example, and then you have differential health outcomes. So there's a lot of literature that's shown the relationship between a differential exposure to environmental hazards and pollutants and stressors and adverse health outcomes like asthma, infant mortality, cancer, et cetera. And so when you think about air pollution, for example, and we think about climate change, we talk a lot about greenhouse gas emissions. So whether it be methane, carbon dioxide, but think when we burn fossil fuels, another part of that kind of complex of pollutants are co-pollutants that impact public health. particulate matter, which is dust in the air, 2.5 microns is PM2.5 is one that's very important for public health. It can cause a number of adverse health outcomes. So damage your alveoli, your lung sacs. It can cause asthma, asthma attacks, heart disease, stroke, elevate your blood pressure, contribute to Alzheimer's, diabetes, cause cancer, infant mortality, birth defects, low birth weight births, and also lead to premature mortality, and also impacts life expectancy. That's just one co-pollutant again. So we have greenhouse gas emissions, but those co-pollutants are very important. Okay, so volatile organic compounds, other things to think about. We have polysaccharide hydrocarbons. So that complex of combustion byproducts, we have to think about these from a public health perspective. So as we try to address issues around climate change and climate justice, and we try to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, we have to pay attention to the co-pollutants. I'm also a member of the air quality team for the 5th National Climate Assessment. And these are the discussions that we're having about making sure that we look at issues of equity and justice when we're talking about differential pollution impacts in the context of climate change. So one of the major sources of concern when you think about climate change in agriculture are CAFOs. And we know these are concentrated animal feeding operations. They may discharge into waterways that have a NPDES permit. We know over time that our number of farms have decreased because of vertical integration. The size of the farms, the number of animals per farm has increased over time. And I did my dissertation on industrial hog farms in North Carolina. And we know that there's increased risk of diseases for folks who live near these facilities. There's been research that's shown that there's a differential burden of these operations, particularly when it comes to industrial hog farms based on race, ethnicity, and income. I've shown in my master's work the differential distribution of these facilities based on race, ethnicity in Mississippi. And there's similar work has been done in South Carolina. One of the main researchers that kind of led this work is Dr. Steve Wing. And his work in North Carolina found that there was definitely a differential distribution of industrial hog farms across race, ethnicity, and SCS in the state of North Carolina. And we know that most of those operations are in the hydrophysiologic plain of North Carolina, eastern North Carolina, where you have a lot of rivers, a lot of streams, right? So a lot of concerns for water quality and impacts on public health in rural areas. And so you think about those impacts, issues around infant mortality, septicemia, low birth weight birth, respiratory impacts, exposure to things like particulate matter, volatile organic compounds could lead to burning of eyes, nose, and throat. Research has also shown associations between exposures and impacts on mental health. Also, immune suppression, and think about hydrogen sulfide exposure and impacts as well. And so when you think about looking at these emissions from these facilities, there are a lot of methane issues with CAFOs. So if you think about climate change and impacts, agriculture contributes a lot of this methane. So you think about the factory farm system of hogs, there's been a 44% increase in methane levels since 1990. In dairy, 122% increase in methane. So these operations are a major source of methane, as we all know is a major greenhouse gas. So let's think about other impacts. We know there's various climate-related perturbations that are a concern. We think about climate change, right? So forest fires, we think about flooding, sea level rise. We also had to talk about hurricanes. We know in the Gulf Coast, for example, there was more named storms in the history of named storms last year. We had 7 named storms, I think, that made landfall. And as we remember, Hurricane Ida, for example, hit New Orleans on the 60th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. But how is that relevant to, CAFOs? Well, we know in 1999, Hurricane Floyd, which you see a picture here, was a huge hurricane that hit North Carolina. Remember I said, most of these CAFOs are in the eastern plain of North Carolina. So what happened? We saw a lot of animals die. And thinking about the flooding and thinking about the toxic soup that people had escaped out of that hurricane, and thinking about the impacts of dead animals, animal waste. And remember, in most rural areas, people are on well water. So the impacts on water quality, and Dr. Wing actually did a study to look at flood risk and impacts from Hurricane Floyd on communities that host industrial hog farms. And then you look at Hurricane Florence later. That hurricane dumped 11 trillion gallons of rain. And you saw similar issues with animal death. So you think about the risk to the environment, risk to human health, when you have these type of operations in the area that may be hurricane prone. And then when you think about these facilities, you also have to talk about sort of the whole continuum of this industry. So we know we have meatpacking facilities, for example. We also have now these new biogas plants where we're trying to capture methane, right? But these facilities tend to leak a lot, and there's a lot of problems scientifically with how they're operated. But you have methane again as a greenhouse gas of concern, and you also have other noxious gases that have an impact on public health. Remember, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia; those are two major sort of byproducts that can impact air quality for those who live near these facilities. And so there are impacts on public health. Again, there's impacts on environmental quality. There can be impacts on water quality. So overall, when you think about the climate change issues here, it's really important to think about not just the climate-related perturbations that could be caused by greenhouse gas emissions, but it's the impacts of the emissions from these facilities that can impact local populations, human health, quality of life. So what are some of the tools for environmental climate justice? One of the things that I do a lot of, and it was mentioned I think in the introduction about this current administration and Justice 40, going back to Executive Order 14008, CEQ is developing a climate and economic screening tool that's allowing folks to kind of map areas of concern to identify, prioritize disadvantaged communities that may need investments and get Justice 40 benefits. I do a lot of work in building screening tools as well, and I helped to build a tool called Maryland EJ Screen. Maryland EJ Screen is a mapping tool that allows you to map environmental justice at the census tract level. It builds off of the Cal Enviro Screen. Cal Enviro Screen is the oldest state level screening tool. And so you can utilize local data. So the great thing about state level tools, you get context specific data. The national tools are great, but they're initial screen. To really be able to understand what's happening in your state, you need your own tool because there may not be there may be data missing in the national tool. So I think state level tools are going to be more robust, more context specific, have more granular data, and be better for decision making at the state level than a national tool, whether it be US EPA EJ Screen or whether it's the CEQ tool. So we borrow our method of doing an EJ score from Cal Enviro Screen. So it's basically 4 buckets of 4 domains of indicators. You have your environmental exposures, environmental burdens. You have your social demographic composition, your indicators, and you also have sensitive populations. So when you think about those 4 categories, pollution burden could be proximity to Superfund sites, proximity to landfills, proximity to toxic release inventory facility. I think initially in many of the tools, they did not have proximity to CAFOs. So it means the tools were very urban centric, but you can make sure these tools will be relevant to rural areas. You have to have agricultural indicators. We received funding from Region 3 of the EPA to improve Maryland EJ Screen. And so we're in the process right now of bringing in rural indicators, relevant agricultural indicators as well. So rural indicators like Wi-Fi access, being unincorporated, well water use, right? Septic tank use, proximity to unincorporated area. You have mining operations that tend to be in rural areas. And we also have CAFOs, total tonnage of waste produced, those type of indicators that are built into the tool so we can capture EJ phenomena in rural areas. And so we have other categories like environmental effects, and that could be pollution exposure and cancer risk, sensitive populations like children and elderly, and then socioeconomic factors like race. So our tool includes race because race is a proxy for a lot of the social process that lead to differential burden. And it's important to include race and other relevant indicators like segregation and redlining and et cetera in these type of tools. And so in addition to this tool, we also have a park equity mapping tool. And so the only reason I mention that, when you think about issues around climate change and mitigation, adaptation, we want to think about, access to natural infrastructure. We know that green infrastructure, particularly in the urban context, is very important. Tree canopy, green space, having bioswales, et cetera, that will allow for, sort of mitigating the impacts of climate, particularly urban heat islands and heat issues. And we know that a lot of the research out there about differential heat impacts because some communities don't have access to tree canopy, don't have really great access to natural infrastructure. So that's one of the tools that we built. And we also are building a climate equity health mapping tool as well. And so I've already kind of talked about the new additions to the tool, through some of the funding from the US EPA Region 3 to bring in these agriculture and rural indicators. We are also bringing in more low-cost data, air quality data from low-cost sensors into the tool, which is very important when you think about greenhouse gas emissions and also those co-pollutants that like black carbon, volatile compounds, particulate matter. We're also bringing in tree canopy data. We're bringing in heat data into the tool. And one of the things just to note, in many of the tools, as I said, they're out there, they don't include agricultural operations. They don't include CAFOs. They also do a poor job of capturing tribal communities too. So I know the second speaker will talk about that, but these tools have to do a better job of not just being good on urban areas, but also being good in capturing the environmental phenomena, social phenomena that can contribute to environmental justice and climate injustice in rural areas. And so here's just a little bit of what we're doing for the Climate Equity Mapper tool. We're using the SOVI index, CDC's index. We're bringing a lot more health data in. We're bringing in projections, flood projections into it, temperature data into it, and other indicators that really capture, climate change, climate-related perturbations, and really getting at these issues of differential risk. Because of underlying social, geographic, and economic vulnerabilities, right? And so with these tools, you really want to bring in an equity focus, and that speaks to Executive Orders 13990, I believe, and 13995, which is an important part of this work. And I've done some mapping in the past to look at climate change risk across the country. And again, this will allow you to, when you use GIS, to identify, prioritize, and micro-target communities of concern that may have differential climate risk. And this is also an approach that could be used by scientists at the USDA. And I think my time is up, but I think it's very important to know when we're going to talk about, science and climate justice and think about environmental justice, you can't just talk about the problems, you have to talk about solutions. So I just want to end with that note that there's some things out there that can be done that folks are doing right now to address climate justice in urban areas, in rural areas. But I'll close there. Thank you for the time. Yeah, let's go to the end. Thank you.
Should I start, or what's the next process here?
Take it away, Dr. Lake.
Okay, thank you. Let me click to my slides there. All right, well, thank you today. Sorry I might have my video capacity working. We organizers work very hard to try to have the best delivery, but ran into a few complications. So I'm talking over the phone, and hopefully you'll be seeing my first slide here. Let me know, give me a thumbs up or a head nod, and then I'll know I'll be able to proceed from that point. Thank you very much. My name is Frank Kanawha Lake. I'm a Karuk descendant. My half-siblings are Yurok tribal members. I'm part of the tribal community here in Northwest California, where I was born and raised, and still participate very much in those cultural practices. As a USDA federal scientist, a lot of my work and what I'll be covering today has started and has evolved from learning how tribes work with federal agencies, in particular USDA and the Forest Service, around land and resource management. And then with me, I'll talk a bit about traditional ecological knowledge. I also want to mention it's important to recognize whose territory I'm in. I'm at the Arcata Lab here in Humboldt County in the land of the Wiyot ancestral territory in the area of Guadini, which is among the redwoods. And so when thinking about that, what are some of our reasons for partnering with tribes and indigenous communities? In many regards, we think about our trust responsibilities as a federal agency from the government to government. There's recent national authorities around this, particularly around indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and other aspects of that, but there's congressional authorities, there's executive orders, and there's other presidential, legislative, and judicial directives that formulate that for us as a government-to-government relationship and that trust responsibility. At the more local level, there's federal agencies and tribal departments and programs within those, and those really revolve in my work around resource management and thinking about the research there to support that, and the work around various things like forestry, watershed and fireshed, landscape restoration, wildland fire, and also climate adaptation and doing vulnerability assessments and more. And where it really comes to home, and particularly around environmental justice, is working on the ground at that person-to-person level or with tribal community members and those families. And this is where we can look at the application of indigenous knowledge to that and working with Western knowledge to create that best available science and understanding that, and also understanding, in particular to environmental justice issues, what are those local level factors that those tribal communities through individuals and families are experiencing. And a lot of my work for this is supported by USDA Forest Service and the Northwest Climate Science Adaptation Science Center. So to kind of ground us in this, really there's a recent executive office of the president came out with this memorandum on indigenous terrestrial ecological knowledge. We also have the co-stewardship, co-management joint secretarial order, and thinking about how that also can be a way in which we're thinking about the climate justice and climate work. There's a recent executive order 14008 on tackling climate crisis at home and abroad, and thinking about that as it relates to the USDA action plan. There's new and reinforced partnerships as part of that with tribes, continued and expanding cross-boundary collaboration with tribes, and will work better to understand tribal needs for climate data. I also would like to add that the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, ITEP, is also one of the partners I work with who has a national focus on looking at tribal climate matters, and I would refer you to their sites as well. So when we think about this action plan for climate adaptation and resilience, I'm going to focus particularly around forestry and fire as my examples. So what is ITEC or TEK or indigenous knowledge or native knowledge? There's a working definition under that Council of Environmental Quality, but it's a body of observations, oral and written knowledge, practices, and beliefs that promote environmental sustainability and responsible stewardship of natural resources through the relationships of humans and environmental systems. It is applied to phenomena across biological, physical, cultural, and spiritual systems. It has evolved over millennia and continues to evolve, including the insights based on evidence acquired through direct contact with the environment and long-term experiences, as well as extensive observations, lessons, and skills passed from generation to generation. And another aspect of that, part of that directly quoting from it, the federal government has previously received requests to develop guidance for federal agencies on how to partner with tribal nations and native organizations regarding the application of indigenous terrestrial ecological knowledge where appropriate. ITEC can and should inform federal decision-making along with scientific inquiry. And that's where we come again. I basically feel that in our trust responsibility on the research side, if we co-produce and develop the best available science to inform management and to affect policy, then we're fulfilling that in our relationships with indigenous people and those federally recognized tribes and others. So a lot of current efforts are expanding opportunities and working with tribes through partnership. It's helping broaden and strengthen landscape, forest, and watershed restoration, research planning and management activities to fulfill that trust responsibility, and having the tribes and the public as the co-beneficiaries as a result of those partnerships. It's responding to the challenges of environmental degradation, the conservation of at-risk species, and climate change that acknowledge the strengths of tribal governance and socio-ecological systems for resilience and adaptation to benefit the tribes and society. And again, a lot of this work is also being conducted more nationally and locally through different regional climate hubs in the Science Adaptation Science Centers. And current efforts in working to expand those opportunities, a lot of it can take place through collaborative research, again, to inform adaptive management and monitoring to evaluate the achievement of those land and resource management plan objectives or the goals of both federal, state agencies, tribes, other organizations, and other partnership entities. It's having governance in the leadership and administrative of those departments and having operational programs that support projects to accomplish those above and below approaches. And a lot of this work is done, again, through memorandums of understanding or agreements at the government-to-government level. And when you achieve that, it's reflected in enhanced lands, waters, and resources, as well as the socio-ecological community's well-being that increases their overall adaptive capacity and reduces the stressors or the aspects that cause the vulnerability in environmental justice issues in the first place. So what are some climate adaptation strategies to consider from a tribal or indigenous perspective? They often include, in this regard, forestry and fire management that are culturally informed practices that integrate the management of trees, plants, fungi, and animals to serve the needs of indigenous communities, tribes, and a broader society. So some of the questions I'll hopefully be asking here and addressing during this presentation for you are what are tribal stewardship practices such as indigenous fire stewardship and cultural burning to consider that can increase ecosystem services and increase climate change adaptive capacity? What are some of the primary considerations for wildland fire management, coupled with indigenous fire stewardship that relate to climate, conservation, and economic interests and values of those tribes and that community? Are there other factors or emerging issues that could affect how tribal communities contribute to drought-tolerant, fire-adapted species as culturally significant resources for broader socio-ecological resilience? For me, this is really incorporated into the full cycle of research, where we're creating the best available science to achieve what we want to as a form of justice. So we have what our researchable questions are, learning what the tribe's science support needs are in the partnership entities, developing those metrics that are applicable to that community, as well as the scientists to inform methodologies, also to inform the analysis, how you interpret your results or those findings, and the discussion and broader recommendations. And then what is the application of that indigenous and Western knowledge to create that science, to improve management, to achieve those for broader sociocultural values? And so in that full cycle, again, sharing and contributing knowledge to then where tribes and society become the beneficiaries of that as a form of justice. Some of my approaches, I've been working with colleagues and tribal entities and tribes, is to discuss and evaluate the vulnerability to and the resilience of traditional knowledge systems, those cultural practices, including fire use, climate effects, and the ecosystem services derived by forest. A big component of that is to understand if it's ascribed or if it's self-determined. It's an important one. I think a lot of prior assessments done by non-tribal entities have ascribed certain levels of vulnerability and may not be as quietly as accurate or as descriptive as a tribe or a tribal community who self-determines that and helps relate that. So we need to consider that both in wildfire risk reduction or climate vulnerability assessments, also how that formulates adaptation plans, and how our tribes uniquely addressing this. To be able to organize and develop examples using those cultural areas and ecoregions is an approach for me, focusing very much in the Northwest and in California, but this is also a need greater for other areas beyond that and across the United States. So for me, part of this is to describe and characterize the tribally valued ecosystem habitats and resources. These are important resources such as water, foods, materials for basketry and other uses, medicines, regalia or ceremonial species, and then linking that to those forest habitats that are used for those cultural practices, whether they're ceremonial, subsistence, as well as economic resources and stewardship. It's helping identify what climate and fire impacts on tribally valued habitats and resources are, and understanding the different ways and mechanisms in which tribes utilize those species that often aren't emphasized in Western science-based climate synthesis. So there may be more focus not solely on vegetation, but particular types of species such as shrubs, forbs, or other forest resources used for the above reasons I mentioned above. And then also taking an interdisciplinary approach to this to synthesize that sociocultural as well as ecological data to identify how climate-related threats and stressors, in this case wildfires or drought, to those forested ecosystems and those related cultural practices within those tribally valued habitats. So a lot of this is a different way in which we approach our evaluation. So we think about what are those resources and how climate and associated disturbances are affecting those. Again, there's different cultural processes from ceremonial, religious, or subsistence, even the commercial. And at what scale is that affecting the individuals, the family, or the broader community? Identifying those mechanisms and understanding what the pathways are of that disturbance and how that affects that tribal community. As Dr. Wilson very well set me up for this and helping us understand this, there's broader climatic impacts affecting indigenous people, and particularly the legacies of colonization and settlement. In many ways, there's unconscious bias from the way that our federal governments have even developed our approaches because we haven't worked as closely or haven't really understood as well from that tribal perspective what we're evaluating, how it's being evaluated, and what are the implications to that tribal community. So we think about that. And then again, how our knowledge systems can come together as that best available science. And I also say again, what are the metrics that we're using? Are we measuring certain things that are also relevant to the tribe, or are there some things unique to that tribe that they want to relate that we then could be considering in our federal trust responsibilities? In many ways for tribes, it's connecting those historical management goals to contemporary management goals and a contemporary context for cultural goals. And so right in the center of that one, very much is climate change adaptation. Some of my work in the last year is the work of the ITEC, the Institute of Tribal Environmental Professionals, and having this Chapter 4 on the status of tribal climate adaptation plan here. And this one on Chapter 4 on ecosystems and biodiversities, we focus very much on wildfires. They have grown in extent and severity across the United States. Their legacies are very much of colonization and fire exclusion and suppression and increasing the fuel loading. So again, what are the factors that are increasing that at-risk component, and how does that affect environmental justice in our consideration? Wildfires are increasing ecological transformation across many areas. That's affecting, especially for tribes, as fire-dependent or forest-dependent communities are being impacted perhaps more than the regular community or the non-tribal community. Climate-induced extreme drought, weather, especially hot, dry winds, and wildfires are negatively impacting the environment and the tribal community or society within those places. And tribal communities are disproportionately impacted by wildfires because of the burn areas and environmental change that's being experienced more rapidly, particularly the wildfire smoke, but then also post-fire erosional or water quality impacts. And then with that, for tribal people, having that being their ancestral territory and many of them having spiritual or other cultural beliefs about being stewards of their relationship and the environment or nature as part of their relations, that also adds to mental and physical health impacts as well. And then so the legacies of prior colonization affect tribal security and their sociocultural resistance or resilience to be able to face these climate impacts. So for me, a little bit more about this and that tribal philosophy is that fire is medicine. And so within a fire-prone ecosystem, dependent upon fire-dependent species, tribal knowledge and cultural practices influence fire regimes as part of that cultural adaptive practice to become fire-dependent cultures. And so when we think about how climate is affecting this, it's that close coupling of the tribal people in their environment, particularly through the relationship of fire, that is one of those things we need to consider in our climate justice work. When we're working to learn about this, there's many ways to recognize that there's different members of indigenous communities hold different types of knowledge and practice various types of stewardship, and are also differentially or could be impacted by climate effects in different ways, or the environmental justice issues that may affect them between elderly women, younger men, what part of the tribal community they may be from, their socioeconomic status, and more and more. But think about that. Also, the things around indigenous fire stewardship and cultural burning, they're often reflected on their roles, both spiritual or ceremonial, subsistence, basket weaving, food gatherers, ceremonial leaders, or if also they're tied to working in the woods as part of the industry there and thinking about that, or fisheries or other aspects of that. And that relates to their responsibilities and even governance, both within traditional and more formal government systems of tribes. So in working with diverse indigenous communities, think about this at the different scales of tribes or villages, those groups such as clans or families, and then thinking in the ways in which you can be working with those leaders to support inclusivity of a fuller range of types of indigenous knowledge to inform our climate work. For many of the tribes out here, and I've seen this even increasing across the West, and then more to the East now, is that indigenous fire stewardship and cultural burning can be strategies for addressing climate change and adaptation. Generations of government-induced fire suppression and forced removal of tribes from their ancestral territories has resulted in increased fuel loading and changes in species composition. But many tribes are saying, as part of their adaptive capacity and reducing that vulnerability or stressors, is to promote those drought-tolerant, fire-adapted species, having more resilient or resistant vegetation. And we also have to think now very much about the implications for carbon as we look at the trade-offs and being able to restore forests and be able to reintroduce fire for cultural purposes as, again, a form of justice. Thinking about the interconnectedness of indigenous stewardship, biodiversity, and ecosystems, it's a coupling of those socio-ecological and cultural fire regimes. Tribal stewardship approaches can increase and promote that species diversity, increasing resistance or resilience among those habitats and between species. It can help moderate or buffer against extreme events that expand their range of variation or climate-induced disruptions. So we think about reducing fuel loading, so that way if and when there is a wildfire that's burning under the most extreme climatic conditions, it's reducing that intensity, the resultant fire behavior and resultant severity are then decreased. We also think about tribal stewardship as kind of bottom-up, local-scale adaptive strategies that are practiced by individuals within their families or social units that then have a greater landscape-level effect. This can very much be a form of climate adaptation through the restoration of forests, reinstating cultural fire regimes, and those cultural practices. A lot of this is focusing on the structure and the composition and ecologically and culturally valuable parts of forests, shrubs, and grasslands. So how do we learn about that? How is that related through each different tribal territory and each different ecosystem? The importance of teaching that traditional knowledge of fire ecology to youth and adults is increasing that adaptive capacity and understanding how tribes work with their environment and those resources or habitats of value. And a lot of this is taking place around the communities, around the wildland-urban interface, other egress or road systems, that very much focusing on some key habitats as anchor points across the landscape to build upon. So when thinking about creating the best available science with tribes, have tribes and tribal organizations as our research partners, learn of what the researchable questions and science support needs are, particularly what are the environmental justice or other issues that are affecting their capacity and ability to be contributors and be partners and lead that, to develop and implement both those national and regional scale research initiatives or programs, that government-to-government relationship through different agreements or memorandums of understanding, having tribal input and participation with, as well as the oversight and review of research methodologies, so having data sharing agreements, intellectual property rights and plans, how data is also shared with the public, what's considered sensitive or otherwise not, and it can be released, and having tribal participation with that creation of best available science to inform policy development and for the management of landscapes and resources. And ultimately, what I hear most from tribes is to acknowledge the differences, but the similarities we have in looking at Western indigenous knowledge and that co-production of the science. But then ultimately, my example is having elders or community members contribute their knowledge, having other tribal people who work within the professional arena as those departments or programs on the ground, and then intergenerationally, after the partnership entities have worked to restore our landscape, reducing those threats and stressors of climate, having identified those climate-related stressors, serving as, again, a form of justice when they can go back to their ancestral territory across jurisdictions and have better security, have better adaptive capacity, and reduce those factors of vulnerability. Thank you for that. That's the end of my presentation.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Wilson and Dr. Lake, for sharing your knowledge with us today. This has been an incredibly informative webinar and clearly illustrates we have a lot of discussion yet ahead of us. Thank you all to today's participants for your questions and engagements. Please keep submitting questions as they arise. A recording of today's presentation will be available on USDA's YouTube site soon, so keep an eye out for that. And a recording of May's webinar is available online now. I would like to take a moment to invite you to next month's seminar, July 14th, with Dr. Grant Domke of the U.S. Forest Service and Dr. Chuck Rice from Kansas State University, who will be discussing greenhouse gases in agriculture and forestry. We hope to see you again on July 14th. Thank you again to our speakers and our participants. Enjoy the rest of your day.